Newspaper and television reporters have been criticized over the years, especially during times of war and military conflict. What is the responsibility of a free press? 14 years ago, critics say the U.S. media was partly to blame for not asking tough questions during the run-up to the Iraqi war, when U.S. President George W. Bush claimed Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein had a ready stockpile of weapons of mass destruction. Once again, critics say the media is not doing its job following this month's U.S. Tomahawk cruise missile operation in Syria, which was prompted by the suspected chemical attack on Syrian civilians. Within hours of the missiles being fired, a number of broadcasters were quick to praise U.S. President Donald Trump.
Reid, it's day 78 of the Trump presidency. What changed last night?
I think Donald Trump became President of the United States. I think this was actually a big moment.
We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these two U.S. Navy vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, "I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons." And they are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield.
That was some of the coverage after that airstrike. Earlier, I spoke with former U.S. Ambassador Peter Galbraith to get his thoughts on how the American media covered the Iraq war. Ambassador Galbraith, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you.
You have been blistering in your criticism of the Bush administration for what was a very costly and bungled war in Iraq. But today on the show, we're looking at the role of the media in this march to war. Did the media, as CNN put it, check its skepticism at the door and trumpet the claims of top officials and unnamed sources as fact?
Yes, I think they did. Probably the biggest point was to check common sense at the door. The core issue was not whether Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. The issue was whether Iraq had nuclear weapons. It was perfectly reasonable to presume that Iraq had chemical weapons. It, after all, had used them again in the Iran-Iraq war and against the Kurds. But chemical weapons, are very limited utility, particularly against modern armies. Real issue is nuclear weapons. Once the inspectors were back in Iraq, there was no chance that Iraq could hide a nuclear weapons program because it requires a large industrial facility, and that can't escape inspection. And there were many other situations where the media really didn't pick up, with some exceptions, the lack of planning and many of the things that led to the disaster that Iraq is today.
There is one view that the U.S. media was duped and put in a sort of intolerable situation where it could be accused of being unpatriotic if it criticized or questioned the intentions of the White House. The other view, as former New York Times journalist Chris Hedges wrote in his book, "War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning," is that the notion that the press was used in the war is incorrect. The press wanted to be used. It saw itself as part of the war effort. Do you agree?
I think the press wanted to be part of the story, and they took too uncritically what was fed to them by the administration. I have to say the administration, undoubtedly believed its own propaganda, but there were journalists, notably Jonathan Landay at McClatchy, whom I knew from his time covering the Balkans, a really intrepid and smart reporter who got the story right.
Could anyone, including the media, have known the consequences of this war in Iraq? I mean, the charitable view is that war is messy, and as some administration officials have said, we went in with the best of intentions, but it didn't turn out the way we wanted it to.
Well, there's a difference between the cliche, no plan survives the first encounter with the enemy, and what happened in Iraq, where there was no planning at all. And here the media and academics and even the Congress did not bear down on what was the core mistake, which was the absence of any serious planning for what they would do once they got to Baghdad. As a friend of mine said, we didn't invade Iraq, the country. We invaded the Iraq of our dreams, a place that we imagined to exist. And we were ignorant of the reality. And well, when we knocked the kaleidoscope in all sorts of new ways, we were surprised. The ignorant are always surprised. So, if there'd been a focus on some realistic reporting and challenging the administration. What's going to happen in Kurdistan? Do you really think the Kurds are going to accept being part of Iraq? What about the Shiites? Aren't they going to be Iran's allies? Are the Sunnis just going to accept the ouster? Somebody challenging the assumption that the police would just continue to function when the Americans got there rather than disappear. I mean, there was a real lack of analysis as to what was likely to happen.
And if we look at all the analysis that was done after the war, the media believed the Bush administration's distortions, its lies. But there was a piece in Salon.com written by Gary Camille in which he said the press's most notable failure was its inability to determine why this disastrous war was ever launched. In that respect, how did this affect American public opinion? If the public was well informed, if it knew the reasons for going to this war, or lack thereof, would this war have taken place?
Well, I think if people had known there was no real threat from Iraq, it would be very hard to justify the war. And of course, when it was clear that Iraq did not have a nuclear weapons program because there were inspectors, and with inspectors you couldn't hide it, that this is something the media could have and should have picked up on. But the disaster is not just the decision to go to war. It is everything that followed from it. And what followed from it was predictable. We wouldn't be having this conversation if the war had gone the way the Bush administration dreamed it would, fantasized it would. Even if there were no weapons of mass destruction, had this been a conflict in which, a few hundred American soldiers had died, gone into Baghdad, got rid of Saddam Hussein, who was, a mass murderer, indisputably a terrible figure, and Iraq had emerged as a stable democracy, we wouldn't be having this discussion. So it isn't just a focus on the misrepresentation of the threat from Iraq, but it is, one should also focus on the fact that there was no planning for what followed. In short, even if there had been a threat from Iraq, going into Iraq was still a disaster because there wasn't a way to accomplish what the Bush administration wanted to accomplish.
Would it be fair to say that if we look at the broad role of the media, that at some point journalism morphed into state propaganda, or is that being a bit too harsh?
I think that's being too harsh. I mean, I think what you have, first there were journalists who were very courageous and did a very good job covering the story. Actually, I went to Baghdad in April of 2003 as part of a ABC News investigative team led by Brian Ross, and we were reporting right from the start the lack of planning, the looting, the fact that sites that Colin Powell had identified as places where there are biological weapons, that they were looted because there was no plan to protect the sites that were supposedly so dangerous. So there was a lot of reporting, and I also would draw the distinction between the reporters who went into Iraq and those who were in Washington. Those who went into Iraq, particularly those who were not embedded with the military, that is, who went on their own, they began to get the story. The propaganda aspect really came from the journalists, the very large press corps that's covering the White House, the State Department, the Pentagon, the CIA, and who are taking what is fed to them. And this is a real problem because these journalists, they want to get a scoop. And the way they get a scoop is to get their source to give them something sensational. They want to write it in the most sensational way. It often turns out that isn't true. This is why so much of the media about Iraq's WMD was hyped. If a reporter got the story and didn't hype it, well, then he wouldn't get his source to give him stuff the next time.
It seems here there was an intention to control the message, not just the message, but the messenger as well. If we look, for instance, at the Vietnam War and the role that the media played there in bringing that war to an end, those reports from journalists like Walter Cronkite and others like David Halberstam, it played a big role in shaping American public opinion. But here in the Iraq War, we had this concept of the embedded journalist. We had rules that said no pictures of the dead, no pictures of coffins returning to Dover Air Force Base. It, in a certain way, sanitized the war. And the media was complicit in that, wasn't it?
Well, first, I think there were two major complicities. The first was when people inside the administration gave to reporters generally with whom they had relationships, gave them stories and information that they wanted the journalist to hype, and the journalist, eager for a scoop, eager to get on page one, hyped the threatening news about Iraq's WMD. The worst kind of reporting is the hyping that goes of stuff that's leaked about intelligence and from the CIA. Because those reporters, they get their rewards by doing what their sources want done, which again is to hype the story. So that was one problem. The second problem was the embedded journalist who is accompanying the soldiers. Inevitably, when you're with your fellow soldiers or soldiers in a Humvee, there's a camaraderie that develops. And so they're there telling the good story about the brave Americans and the battles and their successes and the heroism, the rescue of Jessica Lynch, which of course turned out not to happen. So that's a second set of problems. In terms of the sanitizing the story, well, first I think there were photos of the bodies returning at Dover. And then there were journalists who were neither embedded, who weren't part of the Washington establishment, right, who did tell the story. I mean, the story has not been a good one out of Iraq. So there are people who told the story.
That was Ambassador Peter Galbraith talking to me earlier. Let's get to our panel right now. Should the American press be more critical when it comes to U.S. military conflict and democracy? Joining me in the studio is retired CIA analyst Ray McGovern. Also with us is Sam Sachs. Sam is a reporter and founder of the District Sentinel. Thanks to both of you for joining us.
Welcome.
Ray, let me start with you. We just heard that interview there with Peter Galbraith. What do you make of the role in the media and the point that Ambassador Galbraith made, that when we look at coverage of the State Department, the Pentagon, the White House, in many instances, reporters are just repeating what they've been told?
There's stenographers, actually. And, the worst is that when you listen to others say that it was a terrible mistake about the intelligence before Iraq, before the invasion of Iraq, well, I'm sad to say that it wasn't a mistake. It was fraud. It was out-and-out fraud. And my great grief is that my former colleagues fully participated in that fraud. And the fact that no mainstream journalist, except Jonathan Landay, who was working for Knight Ridder at the time, could uncover that fraud is unconscionable. That's what we have now. That's what we have exactly now. There are people being paid big bucks to simply regurgitate what they hear from the State Department, what they hear from the White House.
And I think Mr. Galbraith made a pretty good point when he's talking about embedded reporters. They're there with the soldiers. They develop a camaraderie. Right. And it's tough to report critically. And you see that very much here in D.C., even with whether it's Washington Post or New York Times or mainstream cable news outlets. These are the people, they're dining together, the reporters and sources, they're appearing on TV all the time together. So you naturally develop this sort of friendship, and you start to view the world in the same sort of way. And there's this consensus thinking in Washington that dominates both parties, really. That is, economically a bit conservative, embracing austerity, socially a bit liberal. But when it comes to foreign policy, very hawkish and militaristic. On the same day that President Trump decided to launch these attacks on a Syrian airfield, we had Hillary Clinton out there calling for the same exact sort of attack. So what you see when the media fawns over this coverage is the media buying into that same sort of conventional thinking that dominates Washington and is dominating both parties right now.
Right. Ray, there was a great posting by Dan Rather, the former CBS anchor, on Facebook. He said the number of press who have lauded the actions of the U.S. bombing of Syria as presidential is concerning. War, he says, must never be considered a public relations exercise. It is not a way for an administration to gain a narrative.
Well, he should know. He, at one time, several years ago, confessed to explaining why journalists act that way, because they didn't want to be necklaced. Necklace, the allusion to what happened in South Africa, right, very often with burning tires thrown around their neck. I guess to bring this up to today's exercise of the media, they have bought hook, line, and sinker the notion that Bashar al-Assad dropped a chemical weapon on this poor village in Idlib province. It's a lie. We know it's a lie. They know it's a lie. It's just as much a lie as weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. What happened was there was this storage facility with chemicals in it. Not chemical weapons, but chemicals that they can put together or make weapons with. The Russians told us in the deconfliction center, our Syrian friends are going to bomb that facility. We know there's some chemicals in there, but we don't know how many. But they're going to bomb that. So we had at least 24 hours, usually 2 to 3 days, to look at all that. We did an assessment, a damage assessment, and our guys said, well, there's probably some in there, but probably not to worry about it. So we had a chance to stop that Syrian flight, and we didn't. When the bomb, it was a GPS-guided bomb, went down into that facility, instead of secondary explosions that you expect to get when you hit an armory or people with weapons in it, we got all this big white smoke come out. The wind was blowing at 20 miles an hour over the village. Now, they know that. McMaster knows that. So does Mad Dog Mattis, okay? And why? Why did they want to do that? Well, 4 days before, Tillerson, the Secretary of State, had said, maybe we ought to let Bashar al-Assad hang around for a while. Nikki Haley at the UN, yeah, well, our primary objective is not Assad anymore. Oh, wow, now it is, okay? Now, that's pretty cynical, but we know that it happens to be true, and it's not a matter of deception here or mistakes. It's the same as it was with weapons of mass destruction, out and out fraud.
Sam, in terms of conflict, there is this question of patriotism. Should the media be patriotic at that time? And it takes all kinds of definitions. George Bush pushed the media into a corner when he said, well, not just to the media, but to everybody, you're either with us or against us. So if you criticize George Bush, then you were against us.
Well, I think the media is generally, mainstream media is generally uncomfortable being an oppositional figure toward the president or toward power here in Washington in general. What's interesting is with Trump, there's been a very mocking nature in the coverage of him, justifiably so. I mean, his administration has been a joke in a lot of regards for the first 3 months here. But there still is this pressure to get on board with something so that you can feel that hurrah moment getting behind the president. And that's what this strike in Syria offered these people who have been waiting for a moment to get behind the president. And the idea of calling a decision to launch military strikes presidential is just absurd. We saw Van Jones make this argument after Trump gave his address to Congress, and he acknowledged the widow of the SEAL who was killed in that raid, which by all reports was a raid that was not very well thought of and was botched. A president acting presidential doesn't just give his military free rein to go and launch these sort of attacks that cause needless death. And you see that same dynamic at work with this mother of all bombs that was dropped in Afghanistan. It looks pretty clear like Trump is just giving the military control to do all this sort of stuff. That doesn't seem presidential to me. There's been moments in history in which U.S. presidents have literally saved the world by overruling the advice of their generals at key junctures. I mean, whether it's the Cuban Missile Crisis, whether it's the Korean War, wherever, there have been generals who have been wanting to use certain weapons on the battlefield, nuclear weapons, that presidents have said no. And I don't think that Trump, an incurious man that he is, who doesn't seem to care and has been known to delegate responsibility all his life, is going to be the guy at that critical moment. He's going to tell his generals, no, I think this is a terrible idea.
Ray, another instance where the media appears to be following the official narrative rather than doing its job independently, and that concerns these allegations that Russia meddled in the United States election. We've seen no proof of that, but we've seen media in this country, and some very well-known media, present this as known fact. This is fact.
Yeah.
There's no qualification that these are allegations or accusations. It's presented as this happened.
Yeah, it's assumed. It's flat fact, as we say in the trade, okay? The only problem is not true. There's no proof adduced to prove it. And it's mischievous, because I see what Trump did over the last week or so as a reaction to his being lumped together with the Kremlin. He's a Kremlin stooge, or he's Putin's friend. And all of a sudden, they got to him. For 4 months, he's been badgered by this. And here's a chance to prove that he's no friend to Putin. He'll charge Putin with conniving with the Syrians to do this attack, which we happen to know it was a mistake in terms of how this thing was released, okay? So I've been in this town 54 years now. I came down when John Kennedy was president and started working at the CIA. I've seen a lot of change, but there's one change that dwarfs all the other changes, and that is that we no longer have a free media in any sense of the word. That's big. You know, Thomas Jefferson, when he was asked if you had to choose between a free press and a government, which would you which would you choose? He said, no problem, a free press, because without a free press, the government can do whatever it wants to do. Bush wanted to seem presidential. The media bought it hook, line, and sinker, and hook, line, and sinker. And when you look at the evidence, well, the evidence is very clear from one of the best experts on chemical warfare techniques, Ted Postel, Professor Emeritus from MIT, who worked for the Chief of Naval Operations for 5 years. And, you know, he knows the government and he knows the science. And he's gone through with a fine-tooth comb this embarrassment of a paper, not signed by the Director of Central Intelligence, mind you, just one of these NSC papers that McMaster's had some political hacks to, okay? And when he takes that apart, he shows in technical detail that this was not something dropped from the air. This was something from the ground. Now, has that been in the New York Times? Well, they must have missed it, okay? But this is the guy that speaks with most authority on that, just as there were some people like Scott Ritter before Iraq spoke with incredible authority because he was the chief weapons inspector for the UN in Iraq. So the media is totally corrupt, in my view. Exactly why? Well, some people say, well, the same corporations that control the media are profiteering on the war. I'm forced to admit that must be part of the answer, but it is corrupt.
Yeah, that is one of the reasons, probably, why the media has changed. What do you think, Sam, the change in the media? I mean, as Ray says, you know, it's serious when you say there's no free press.
Well, I think Ray nailed it. I think it's a huge part, corporations and the influence that they have over the media. The media is very consolidated at the moment, and it's a drive for ratings. To get the highest ratings, you have to get the most powerful people on your shows. That requires access, and to get access, you have to ask softball questions. You can't make these people look like fools on TV. So that leads to softball questions, and that whole thing I mentioned earlier about, you know, playing golf together, going to happy hours together. It causes everybody to be friends, and that's not the sort of adversarial relationship that breeds truth-telling.
Okay, you know, on the one hand, Sam, we have this corporate ownership of the media, but to what extent did the events of 9/11 actually change the media as well?
Well, I mean, I guess they played an effect of kind of in a bunker mentality of us trying to, like, say, as you mentioned at the beginning, the whole Bush saying you're either with us or you're against us. You see that very much in play when it comes to the Russia issue. I mean, the dominant narrative right now in Washington is that Russia hacked the election, that Trump and the Russians were working together. And if you criticize that or ask for more proof, then you are an agent of the Russian government. And I think Ray brings up a good point, is the consequence of that thinking is you might be pushing a president who might not be all there, who we're all very concerned of, to military confrontation with Russia. And I'm not sure the people like Rachel Maddow, who are going on their show every single day and hyping this issue up, have considered what happens if they're wrong on this issue, and all they've done is
it also seems from the media that if you call anyone in Russia, you're talking to a Russian intelligence agent.
That's exactly, well,
you know, with respect to Rachel Maddow, I think the most telling comment that was made on her show was the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer of New York. He said, you know, Rachel, I used to think Trump was a pretty smart guy, but he's made a real blunder. He's done something really stupid. And she says, what is that? He's taken on the CIA. And the CIA has 6 ways to Sunday.
That's right.
To get back at you. I thought he was a smart businessman, but he's done something very foolish. Now, if you were Rachel Maddow, oh man, if I were, we would have said, are you saying that the President of the United States should be afraid of the CIA?
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
Exactly, yeah.
But no, she said, we're going to break, we're going to. Well, you know, that's the kind of stuff that cries out for explanation.
Yep.
And indeed, if I were asked, was there Russian hacking? Of course, everyone hacks, okay?
Yeah.
Was there Russian hacking that left telltale signs like Cyrillic? Okay, yes, there was hacking, but it was not Russian hacking. It was John Brennan, CIA hacking, and we have the proof in the pudding from the latest WikiLeaks release on Vault 7.
Right.
It's right there. They have the tools to hack and make it appear that it's either Russian, Chinese, Arabic, Farsi, or Korean. I mean, it's right there. But is that in the New York Times? Is that in the Washington Post? No.
Talking about WikiLeaks, we just had the current CIA director, Mike Pompeo, say that he described it as a hostile intelligence service. Yeah. I mean, that poses dangers for the entire media, doesn't it?
well, if WikiLeaks is, then so is the New York Times, and so is the Washington Post. I mean, this is why the Obama administration has been unable to file charges or bring a case against Julian Assange, because they know that in doing so, you would be in a pretty thorny situation where you'd have to take on all the media outlets that have also relied on the documents that Chelsea Manning turned over, or whoever sources have turned over to WikiLeaks.
Fascinating times. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Most welcome.
That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.